Undersea cables and pipelines bring us our data and energy. But does their maritime location leave them open to attack? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the world's subsea networks are looking increasingly unsafe. Governments and big tech companies are trying to extend their reach. In recent years, they've been subject to attempted sabotage and snooping. So, how can Europe protect these crucial pieces of infrastructure as state actors try to muscle in?
You know those funny panda videos you watch? Well, they likely come to you via an undersea cable. Around 99% of our global data and communication flow through these fiber optic pipes, as well as more than $10 trillion of financial transactions each day and civilian and military information. If that were to be disrupted, this is what it might look like. A recent global IT outage due to a software glitch stranded passengers and caused widespread disruption in numerous sectors. The world's subsea infrastructure is inherently vulnerable, world leaders are warning. This map shows just how extensive the network of cables that connects continents is.
We know every single day that what's connecting us around the world, physically and digitally, are these cables and the systems that run on them. And we want to make sure that these systems are trusted, that they're secure.
In Europe, the threats to marine pipes have become very real following Russia's all-out war against Ukraine. Take, for instance, what happened to the Nord Stream 1 and 2 gas pipelines, key conduits for Russian natural gas imports to Europe. In September 2022, 7 months after Moscow began its war against Kiev, these pipelines were blown up in a suspected attack. Russia has denied any involvement in the blasts and has instead pointed the finger of blame at the US and UK. Norway, a NATO member, has since become Europe's top provider, sending vast amounts of methane through Poland via the Baltic Pipe. Last year, Norway and other neighbouring states voiced fears over Russia's increased maritime activity.
We've seen over the years that, for example, that Russia has been mapping out several of these wind parks, maritime cables, pipelines, location of underseas critical infrastructure in the Baltic Sea and in the Arctic. And we know that Russia has a fleet that is capable of conducting such sabotage operations. So even though we don't have the evidence,
Sweden, Finland and Estonia have all reported similar network and gas pipeline incidents this year. In a war scenario, military analysts say the severing of cables would quickly bring the US drones or the Five Eyes intelligence systems down. Or take out the data systems of NATO members providing military aid to Ukraine. Western governments have stepped up plans in anticipation of such attacks. Besides more naval and air patrols, NATO has set up a center to protect undersea pipelines. And the alliance is helping fund a project to expand satellite systems should digital networks be taken down.
Well, let's meet our guests. In Tunbridge Wells in England is Bill Mew. He is Global Cyber Ambassador for the International Association for Risk and Crisis Communication. And I'm delighted to say here with me in the studio is Peter Warren, Chair of the Cybersecurity Research Institute, and Amanda Finch, CEO of the Chartered Institute of Information Security. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Peter, I'll come to you first. Just on this issue, we hear a lot of people talking about the cloud, whereas the reality is we really need to be looking under the sea. This is the lifeline of the world in terms of information.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some 90% of the communications that we think of as the internet are going through undersea cables. Undersea cables are really something that is essential. It's essential infrastructure, and we really need to be aware of that.
And just tell me, Amanda, they've been described as the veins of the modern world. We all know what happens to a human if a vein gets cut.
Yeah.
What happens in the information technology world when damage happens to these cables?
Well, obviously, it's the same as a vein in a human being, is that it's broken, so you can't use it. But the good thing is, like the human, that there's lots of other veins there, so there's lots of other cables. So you shouldn't be reliant on one cable to take you from one place to another. There are thousands and thousands of cables under the sea, and we've been doing it since the 19th century. So,
but all of a sudden, the world we live in now, this is crucial infrastructure.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you look at how we do business, how we communicate with each other, everything is reliant on the internet. And as you say, it's not just satellites. That's a very small part of how we communicate. It's mainly through the cables under the sea if we're going from one continent to another, or one country that is going across sea, obviously.
Bill, let's bring you in. These cables, are they Europe's Achilles heel?
I wouldn't say it was just Europe that was at risk. I think it's a global problem. If you're an island nation like we are, or Australia or others, you're particularly reliant on undersea cables. But the whole world, if it's going to engage in any sorts of international communications and commerce, is reliant on these cables.
That obviously makes this infrastructure very, very valuable. And if there is a rogue actor out there, a rogue state, we're seeing a lot of interference from certain countries, the usual suspects. This makes it a very attractive target, for want of a better phrase.
As the CrowdStrike incident recently showed us, we are enormously reliant these days and enormously interconnected, and the technology actually underpins almost everything we do. And again, CrowdStrike showed us that it's not always a malicious action. Sometimes it's a terrible mistake that can bring everything to its knees. And if you've ever had cables accidentally dug up outside your home and experienced the result, you'll know all about this. Therefore, we need to consider critical infrastructure not only from mistakes or a poor maintenance. We also need to consider the malicious actors in terms of deliberate damage, but also snooping.
Peter, just on that point, I mean, we're living in a more and more dangerous world. We see countries actually at physical war with each other. But is there a war going on under the sea in terms of attacking these cables and disrupting and even hacking people's information?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of technology that you can use to snoop on cables. One of the things about that is that a lot of the time it will be pretty undetectable. In terms of the cutting of cables that's been going on, that is really a sort of reconnaissance exercise. It's also an exercise to irritate people. One of the things that you're saying is, perhaps it could be, I don't know, somebody like Russia, for instance, saying, we're really annoyed with something that you've done, so therefore, look, we've just cut your cable. But this snooping is going to be an ongoing problem because the technology is becoming much more sophisticated to monitor traffic flows and to be able to interpret those traffic flows.
So, Amanda, this is almost an unseen battleground.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot easier to do warfare this way than going out to a battlefield, because you can send down a drone or something like that down to the seabed, and you can you don't have to send troops in. So it's wearing down people. Is that if you're sort of undermining the fabric of society and people are scared, then that's when the problems happen, and that's a very good way of scaring people, is to take out some cabling, take out water systems. And that's why we have the critical national infrastructure within the UK. And we have to protect that, because if that breaks down, then people get frightened, and that's when they start behaving erratically.
And the modern way of life now, everyone is so dependent on communication, whether it's WhatsApp, Facebook, various different social media networks. People start panicking when they don't have access.
Yes, they do. And the thing is that they don't know how long they're not going to have access for. We've got so used to just being able to pick up a mobile phone. I mean, if you think about it, back in these, I don't know, the 1970s and things like that, we were used to having power cuts, and people would have torches and candles and things like that. Maybe we're going to a time where people need to think about having a wind-up radio or something like that as a backup, but we just take it for granted it's going to be there 24/7.
Bill, just on that point, looking ahead in the next few years, if there is a major attack on the cable network around Europe, under the seas, how do we go about life if we don't have access to the internet, if we don't have that information flow and one or two countries or more find themselves completely cut off?
I think with the advent of cloud computing, we're seeing more and more reliance on technology assets that are remote from you. And therefore, I think we're more vulnerable than we ever have been in the past. The other thing is that these cables are not only numerous, but they're very long, and often they're located in areas where surveillance and protection is going to be very, very difficult. And if somebody wants to do something malicious to you, it doesn't actually have to be that sophisticated. There was an example just after Finland joined NATO, which sort of raised the ire of people in Moscow, that not only were they targeted by a large number of hacking attempts, but also there was a large Chinese freighter in the bay just off Helsinki that all of a sudden was at anchor and put its engines into full reverse and dragged its anchor for 10 miles, digging everything up in sight. And therefore, you don't have to get a sophisticated attack. It can be a fairly simple one, and it can cause enormous damage.
Peter, I just want to come to you. How do we protect these cables, and how do we police the seabed? Because that looks to be where we're going, doesn't it? I mean, more protection is needed.
Well, I think, as Amanda said, you can put drones down to attack them, but you can put drones down to monitor them. One of the great things about the advances in robotics that's been going on at the moment is that very soon you will be able to have robots travelling along the cables and actually being able to repair them as well. So not only will they be protecting them, they will be repairing them. And we're going to see... You could probably also see some robot battles going on as well, where drones fight each other. But again, you would be aware of that. But as with everything to do with cyber at the moment, attribution is going to be a bit difficult with that.
It sounds extraordinary, Amanda, doesn't it? I mean, it's like James Bond on the seabed, all these battles being played out.
Well, you're talking to somebody that started doing security when we just had standalone PCs and boot sector viruses. So this is a huge way away from that world, but it just shows how the technology's developed. And in many ways, we're still using the same methodologies to actually protect things, which is that you need to be able to detect there's a problem. You need to be able to minimize the risk with it. So all of these ways of protecting our infrastructure have been developed over many, many years, and it's just applying it to a different technology. So there's some experts out there, thank goodness, that are looking after these things for us.
Bill, whose responsibility are these cables? I mean, how does it break down, Europe, all the many, many dozens of nations across Europe? Who ultimately bears responsibility for policing the seabed?
Well, there's no single organisation, and the ownership of these cables is a split between a hybrid number of different organisations. There are many that are public sector or private sector owned from a number of different entities. And therefore, we still don't have a global police force of any kind. And there's always been a sort of an undersea battle going on. I was a weapons engineering officer in the Royal Navy back in the Cold War days when we used to chase Russian submarines all over the place and track their movements. You'd excuse me for having a certain sense of deja vu, because back then the Russians were the enemy, and it appears it might be happening all over again. But this has always been a source of tension. Back in the Cold War, you call this another Cold War potentially. These state entities, these state organizations are exploiting the fact that this infrastructure is incredibly vulnerable.
Peter, just come in on that. I mean, how vulnerable is this infrastructure?
Well, How long is a piece of string, quite literally, isn't it? It's enormously vulnerable because you can get to it in any way that you want to. But though I think one of the points that needs to be made about this is some of these attacks, they are reconnaissance attacks. One of the things that you're wanting to do is find out what the impact of a particular cut in a particular information line is, how that can actually be used. You know, there's a lot of very, very sophisticated strategy that's going on in all of this.
Amanda, just come in on that. I mean, do you think certain state actors in the next few years will be looking at this and thinking we can really disrupt the United Kingdom with an attack here, France, Germany, and in particular, I come from Ireland. We're a small island nation. We have a navy. We're not a member of NATO. Our navy comprises 3 ships, and we have a huge coastline.
Yes.
And in the last few years, various different Russian vessels have paid a lot of attention to the seas off Ireland.
Well, yes, and we've seen it off Scotland as well, that there was an attack where some cables were cut. So I think it will be, because it's another way of basically destabilising, which is what we talked about beforehand. So I think what we have to do is that we have to try and work with our allies, and the allies and friends seem to shift over time. So you need to keep an eye on that. And that you have to just really try and work out where you think the attacks are going to come from. And there are hostile states out there that are going to attack us. And we don't know what they do know, because all we know is where we've seen them try and attack things. They may be, as Peter's been saying, doing a tremendous amount of reconnaissance work, which we haven't seen yet. So we don't know what we don't know as well. So it's important that we stick with our allies, and you've seen initiatives in the EU where they're trying to look at building a sort of inner circle of undersea cables that they know they can trust. But when it goes outside of the EU, then there's less control over it. You've got some international law, but it's not really that effective, because the countries that don't want to play ball won't play ball. So it's going to keep the good guys good and the bad guys not necessarily getting involved. So we need to talk to each other.
Bill, across Europe, many island nations, Ireland, you've got Malta, you've got Cyprus. These are smaller countries with much smaller resources. Are they the real Achilles heel, do you think, when it comes to European undersea cables?
I think they're undoubtedly vulnerable, but people actually wanting to carry out the attacks wouldn't necessarily target them first, because they're not necessarily a high-value target. I would suggest that the UK would be far more of a high-value target, or possibly Australia if it continues to annoy China at intervals. So I think we need to be able to balance actually not only the vulnerability, but also the likelihood that someone's going to be a target.
Peter, Russia has denied all responsibility and says it has not done this and has blamed the West. But it's clear certain countries have an interest in doing this. Do you think we now need to kind of, across Europe, bolster defences, bolster budgets, and start realising that this really is an area of vulnerability?
I think that what we've got to do is wake up to the fact that we're in this modern world. One of the points that hasn't been mentioned is that some of these cables go through choke points, and they're particularly strategic. Alexandria, for example, the North Sea cables that go, the cables that go in there, not North Sea, but that's the access point to Africa, and it's also an access point to India as well, which those people who want to control information flows will be very well aware of. Though Amanda's been saying that this is a network of veins, we've got to get used to the fact that some of them are going to be quite arterial. And that as such, we need to have some sort of plan as to what we're going to do about this. We've got to have some redundancy.
What do you think of what Bill said about a Chinese trawler going into reverse and dragging an anchor for 10 miles, quite deliberately, to rip out Finland's capabilities? I mean, what's the policing, what's the comeback on this?
Well, the problem that we have at the moment is that we don't have any comeback in many areas to do with cyber. One of the problems that we have is attribution, as we've been talking about. At the moment, there's a growing intolerance about the amount of attacks that we've been suffering, the amount of ransomware attacks. Last month, 37 of them. Some of these, one ransomware group has been responsible for $1 billion worth of scams. And nobody's doing anything about them. So in terms of actually what do you do if somebody rips out a cable, hitherto we haven't done anything. One of the points that I think has to be made with growing dependence is that you've got to say, right, we're all dependent on this world. Data is oxygen, and if you start ripping the stuff out, then there's going to be people and economies that will suffer. I mean, going to your point about Ireland, Ireland has become very, very important in terms of banking just recently because of Brexit. That's probably one of the reasons why you're finding a load of Russian trawlers hanging around. It's that or your fish.
But on top of that, Ireland is not prepared to defend a huge coastline. 3 ships, and I mean, they can't be everywhere all at once.
No, and that's coming back to the previous point, which is why you have to align with others, basically, because you can't do it on your own. The other thing in security is that you also have to have resilience. So where we've got these choke points, we need to look at them and make sure that there is alternative routing, even if it's not as effective, but there are alternative routes so that we can get the critical infrastructure back. So we've just got to, it's just another problem that we have to learn to live with. It's not going to go away. And we've just got to work out how we work around it and minimise any attacks to the infrastructure.
Bill, the general public, I think, don't know very much about undersea cables, probably don't care very much, but when disruption happens, that's when they will be screaming for their connectivity.
Well, if anyone's got teenage children and the Wi-Fi goes out, you'll know exactly how quick they are to complain. And it goes far wider than that across all the business infrastructure that support our way of life. We saw with CrowdStrike. But I'd just like to correct one point you made. You talked about Ireland and 3 ships having to protect the entire coastline. That's not the challenge. We know exactly where the cables come ashore. It's only the points where the cables come ashore that are the areas of the coastline we have to protect. The real challenge is the vast areas of oceans and the tracts that are beyond surveillance, where things could be happening underwater and we'd be completely unaware.
That's a good point, isn't it, Peter? I mean, if something is cut mid-Atlantic or off the coast of Ireland or France, how difficult is it to actually fix the problem then?
Well, apparently we can actually fix it relatively quickly. And also we can detect the fact that the information isn't flowing because we know that it's not getting through. And I mean, one of the points about this is this has been going on for a long, long time. These cables have been under attack for around 150 years. So we've got good at being able to put them back together again. As Amanda says, we do need to have resilience. We do need to have other ways around this so that we can switch things in quite quickly. But it's, as I said, it's part of a strategy. You've got people who are sitting there saying, OK, we know that if we take that down, that it will have this impact. And so you're putting that into a much bigger plan. So your plan is, in the event of some military action or in the event of wanting to ramp something up, in the event of wanting to generate some geopolitical tension, and let's face it, geopolitical tension is one of the big worries now in this world that we're in. This is what you do. It's a tool. It's part of the arsenal that you're going to deploy.
Amanda, do you think we've become over-reliant on technology as a species? I mean, Bill jokingly said if you've got teenage children, you'll be quite aware of how much time they spend online and how grumpy they get if the internet goes down. Do you think we've become too reliant?
Gosh, that's a really hard question because would you really want to go back to not having a mobile phone, 30 years ago?
Some people would say that's bliss.
Some people would say it's bliss. Some people really loved COVID and lockdown because they could stay at home, they didn't have to go out. I tend to feel that technology brings goodness and then it brings problems. And it's almost this balance that seems to be there, in the same way as people use technology for good, and then the bad guys also use it for bad. So I think before we start saying, let's go back and we're too reliant on technology, maybe we should all go back to the 1950s for a week and see how we get on without TV and mobile phones and heating systems that come on as soon as you walk in the room. So, yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
What do you think, Bill? Are we too reliant on technology nowadays?
I think we are, because we're in a data-enabled world, and there's no going back whatever. But talking about data enablement means that we also need to consider not just the cutting of the cables, but the snooping, because actually there is enormous value in trying to snoop on other people, and the cables are often a way that organisations seek to do this.
Peter, Amanda and Bill, thank you all so much for your time on Roundtable. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable, TRT World. And if you like what you see there, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.